Hello, my name is Ben, and I'm going to show you how to replace the chain, axle, sprocket, and shock cord on a Model D and row erg. On Model C and Model E, the steps are very similar, and I'm going to point out some differences along the way. For this procedure, you're going to need a T27 screwdriver. For some older model machines, it's going to be a 5/32 Allen wrench, a Phillips head screwdriver, two 9/16 inch wrenches, or you can use adjustable wrenches, and a 7/16 inch wrench. The parts that come in the kit are the 17mm bearing, 17mm bearing cup, the R8 bearing cup, two idler pulleys, the flywheel axle sprocket. This is an unpatched screw that we're going to use to remove the chain idler pulley axle. These 4 screws are specific to the Model C machine and won't be used on the Model D, row erg, or Model E. They are for these U-nuts that are on the flywheel cover for the Model C. You have the chain connectors, and the flywheel axle. Again, the tools you're going to need are the 7/16 inch wrench, two 9/16 inch wrenches, a Phillips head screwdriver, and the T27 screwdriver. And here's the shock cord that we'll be installing as well. We're going to be flipping the machine over, so push the monitor support arm back, and we're going to put the handle up against the chain guide up here, and then separate the monorail from the front end of the machine, and then put the monorail aside. The metal outlet perf that goes around the flywheel housing is held together with the perf connector, usually hidden under one of these 4 screws. Go ahead and loosen, but don't remove that screw that holds the perf connector together. And then remove the 4 fasteners that hold the flywheel cover to the inner pan of the flywheel housing. There are these little nuts that are in a hex hole on the inner pan of the flywheel housing. They will fall out, and you just want to keep an eye on those. It is going to be different on a Model C machine. There's just the 4 Phillips head screws that hold the cover to the inner pan of the housing. Put a wrench on the nut, and if you turn it, it's going to spin the flywheel. So grab the fan blades of the flywheel, and the clutch inside the hub of the flywheel will keep the axle from spinning. And then turn the nut counterclockwise to remove the nut. Once the nut is removed, pull the flywheel straight off of the axle. The non-flywheel side axle nut is underneath this bearing cover. Just pull the bearing cover off of the machine. Make sure that the handle is up against the chain guide, and the chain is going to hold the sprocket from spinning as we loosen this nut off of the axle. Next, we're going to remove the generator and generator housing. Use a Phillips head screwdriver to remove these 2 fasteners here. This does not apply to a Model C machine. And remove the generator housing cover. Some machines are going to have an anti-skip, anti-throw device. We call that the ASAT, and the fastener for the ASAT is right here. So go ahead and remove the ASAT screw as well. And remove the generator from the housing. Removing the generator housing base can be difficult on some machines. This plastic piece here needs to be pushed that way to remove it. You can use a flat blade screwdriver right in here to pry that this way. On this machine, it pops right out. But you can see that this can push here. Next, we're going to remove the handle. You need a 7/16 inch wrench to do that. Pull the handle out, and then flip it over and push the U-bolt so that the nuts are accessible. On a Model C machine with a wooden handle, you're going to want to use a hammer to tap on the U-bolt to make the nuts come proud so that you can remove the nuts from the U-bolt. And then hold the chain and remove the U-bolt from the handle, and then remove the U-bolt from the chain connector, and then let the chain come towards the flywheel axle. Before we flip the machine over, we're going to want to remove the generator base from the machine. You can take this swivel bushing off. And then slide the chain connector through the hole in the generator housing. Some generator housings have a pretty tight spot here, and you'll end up wanting to bring the chain through the generator housing in the other direction once we remove the chain connector from the traveling pulley. With the machine upside down, remove the return mechanism cover. Not all machines are going to have a return mechanism cover. You slide that out between the foot stretchers. On the inside of the machine, you're going to see the shock cord and you're going to see the chain. Shock cords can be green, they can be blue, or they can be white. The shock cord is attached to the shock cord pulley axle with these shock cord adjusting mechanisms. We call them SCAMs, S-C-A-M. Remove the SCAMs from the shock cord pulley axle to remove tension from the shock cord. And now we can grab the traveling pulley, which is where the chain meets the shock cord. We're going to remove the screw and nut that hold the chain connector to the traveling pulley. Use a Phillips head screwdriver and a 7/16 inch wrench to remove the nut and screw from the traveling pulley. And the chain connectors come apart by pushing towards the chain. Next, we're going to remove the old chain from the machine. Note how it's routed inside the machine. I'm going to show how it all is routed once we put the new chain back in. But from the traveling pulley, it goes up to the chain idler pulley up by the flywheel axle, then back to the idler pulley that's in the traveling pulley, and then up to the sprocket that is on the flywheel axle. You can pull the chain out from either direction. I'm going to pull it out from the sprocket side of the machine. Next, we're going to remove the ASAT, the anti-skip, anti-throw device from the machine. Not all machines are going to have an ASAT, but it is on the axle that the chain idler pulley is on, and it pops off. And you can see how it sits on the axle and is on either side of the idler pulley. Machines that do not have the ASAT are going to have a spacer on either side of the idler pulley to keep it centered. We're going to remove the T27 screw from the idler pulley axle. Some machines are going to have a patched screw that was there, and it's going to be a patched screw on the other side as well. And we include this unpatched fastener to put as a placeholder in that case so that you can tighten that in here and then remove the patch fastener from the flywheel side of the axle. Now on Model E machines, there is a cover on the leg here, and Just for ease, I'm going to recommend that you remove that front leg so that you can access all of the inside of the machine. Now on the other side of the machine, you're going to remove the fastener on the other side of the chain idler pulley axle. Here's the location of the chain idler pulley axle fastener that we're going to be removing on the flywheel side of the axle. Once the flywheel side fastener is removed from the chain idler pulley axle, grab the axle with your hand and then remove the placeholder screw that you put on the non-flywheel side of the axle. Now the axle is free to come out of the box frame of the machine. And we can now swap the chain idler pulley on the axle. Again, some machines are going to have a spacer on either side of the axle and you want to replace those spacers. And then put the axle back into the machine. At this point, it doesn't matter what side of the shock cord you're putting it on because we're going to be replacing the shock cord. If you're not replacing the shock cord, you want to make sure that the axle is underneath this part of the shock cord. Once you have the axle aligned and back inside the box frame, put those original fasteners back into the threaded part of the axle. And then replace the fastener on the flywheel side of the axle as well. On the flywheel side of the chain idler pulley axle, we're going to be replacing the fastener, and note that it is the hole that is just below the flywheel axle, given that this machine is upside down. Next, we're going to remove the idler pulley that's on the traveling pulley. We're going to use a Phillips head screwdriver and a 7/16 inch wrench. You're going to reuse the spacer tube that the old idler pulley was on and put it into the new idler pulley and then slide it into the traveling pulley and replace the fastener into the nut. Make sure that the pulley can spin within the traveling pulley. For machines that do have the ASAT, we need to put the ASAT back onto the axle. And this section is where the chain idler pulley goes. And this is the orientation that it's going to end up in. So the easiest way to do that is clip this section onto the axle and slide the pulley in between. And then swing the ASAT towards the top of the frame so that we can put that fastener back in once we reinstall the generator housing base. Next, we're going to remove the shock cord, and to do that we need to remove the frame end cap. There's one fastener that goes into a hook that is on the shock cord pulley axle. Loosen but don't remove the fastener so that you can slip the hook off of the axle, and then remove the frame end cap from the machine. And note that there's the hook and the nut. Grab the shock cord adjusting mechanisms, the scam, inside the machine, and slip the end of the shock cord out of the scam. And do the same on the other scam. With the two ends free, you can remove the traveling pulley assembly out of the machine and pull the old shock cord out. Slip the shock cord out of the notches and pull shock cord right out of the traveling pulley, and now we're going to keep this and install the replacement shock cord. With the traveling pulley, note that the orientation that this will end up in is with the pulley on the top of the frame side. So take the shock cord and we're gonna just put it into the traveling pulley, and what we're looking for is exactly equal lengths of tail. And then slip the shock cord into the notches in the traveling pulley. And now we are going to start routing the shock cord around the pulleys. So again, the pulley is on the inside of the frame, and we're going to take this leg of the shock cord and we're going to go over the shock cord pulley in between the foot stretchers on the flywheel side of the machine. And then come back under. And then with the non-flywheel side of the shock cord, we're going to go under the pulley. Note that you do want to be going around the pulley, so we're not going on top of this hanger shaft that's in between the foot stretchers. And then bring the non-flywheel side of the shock cord back over the top of the pulley and do a check to confirm that this is what your shock cord looks like as we now go to the end of the machine. With the non-flywheel side end of the shock cord, we're going to go make sure you're underneath the leg, you're on top of the chain idler pulley axle, and then you go over the pulley at the end of the frame. Now the flywheel side end of the shock cord still underneath the leg, but now we're going to be going underneath the flywheel axle, so the opposite side, and then out the end of the machine. Next, we're going to return back to the shock cord pulley axle in between the foot stretchers. So we'll start with the flywheel side end of the shock cord, come above the shock cord pulley, and we're staying above the idler pulley axle and underneath the leg. Okay. Grab the scam. Both scams are the same. You're going to slide through this hole with the pinch and give yourself probably about 3 inches of tail, and then into this piece here, and then back through the open hole. And we're going to grab the non-flywheel side of the shock cord and I'll go around the pulley. We're staying underneath the flywheel axle as we come back towards the foot stretchers, and grab the other scam and tie it off the same way we did with the other end. So now we have both ends of the shock cord attached to the scam, and we're going to be putting it onto the axle that holds the shock cord pulleys in between the foot stretcher. And we'll take the non-flywheel side first and bring it around and slide it in and hook it on to the axle. And we're going to do the same on the flywheel side, and we're going to go down. Next, we're going to replace the frame cap on the end of the machine. There's a hook that is on the screw and the nut. We're not going to be touching the nut. The hook holds the nut from spinning while we tighten that screw in place. Before you replace the frame cap, you do want to take a last look at the shock cord and confirm that it's not pinched on any of the pulleys or touching any of the axles. When you replace this frame cap, the shorter end is should be on the lower part of the frame, with the longer end on the top of the frame. It doesn't matter how this hook goes onto the axle. It can go in either orientation, but slide it in and reach with your hand on the inside to get it around the axle, and then use the T27 screwdriver to tighten that fastener in place to hold the hook onto the axle and the frame cap in place. Next, we're going to remove the flywheel axle. You can grab the axle from the flywheel side of the frame and pull it out. It's going to have the old sprocket on there, the old 17mm bearing and bearing cup. With your finger from the inside out, you can pop the R8 side bearing out of the frame, and the bearing cup will come with that, and all of these parts are going to be replaced with new parts. All right, so we've got the two bearings, the R8 bearing and the 17mm bearing, and then the cup for each bearing. Grab the R8 bearing and then slide it into the bearing cup, and you'll see that there are two sides of the bearing cup. The bearing, doesn't matter if you go in this side or this side, it's the same. Push it in, and you want to have the rubber side of this assembly going towards the frame. You can slide that into the bearing mount. You're going to slide the 17mm bearing onto the axle, and we're going over the threaded portion of the axle. With the 17mm bearing on the axle and up against the shoulder, you're going to take the 17mm bearing cup and slide it over the axle and push it over and on to the bearing so that this rubber surface is on the threaded side of the axle. Now you can take the sprocket and slip it onto the axle and screw it onto the flywheel axle. And this only needs to be finger tight. As you start rowing, the chain is going to tighten the sprocket right onto the axle. Now we can slip this into the flywheel side of the machine. This is the flywheel side of the axle, and we're going to be sliding the axle into the frame in this orientation. So go through the hole on the flywheel side of the machine, and the axle will come through the inner race of the R8 bearing. Put the 9/16" nut onto the axle. With the non-flywheel side axle nut finger tight, we're going to slide the flywheel onto the flywheel axle. And thread the nut onto the axle. Grab two 9/16" wrenches. These nuts are nylock nuts, so you're going to feel resistance as you're tightening them, and then you're going to hit the shoulder of the axle, which is a hard stop, and that's where you stop tightening the axle nuts. Now we're going to install the chain into the return mechanism area of the machine. If you found that removing the chain from the generator housing was difficult, then you're going to want to thread through the generator housing now. If it was easy, then you can do that later once we flip the machine back over. So we're going to find the sprocket on the axle, and you can even turn this nut to help you bring that chain around the sprocket and grab the end of the chain and pull it through all the way until the chain connector is hanging about here. We have the chain connector just a few inches outside the top of the frame. You can now replace the R8 side bearing cover. Now we're going to route the chain around the idler pulleys and then back to the traveling pulley. You're going to want your Phillips head screwdriver, 7/16" wrench, the Phillips head screw, the nylock nut, and the 2 parts of the chain connector. Take the end of the chain and we're going to go through the idler pulley and the traveling pulley. So this is the orientation that the chain is going to be going around that idler pulley. Note that the hole for the chain connector is above this. Go underneath the leg and pass, and we're going to go under and then around the idler pulley on the axle. Now take the chain and come back, again underneath the leg, and pass around. Attach the chain connector so the combs go in opposite directions. You'll have a through hole that the Phillips head screw is going to go through in the traveling pulley, and add the 7/16" nut. This is a nylock nut, so we just want to get it threaded into the nut. You don't need to tighten this too much, just make it so the end of the screw is flush with the end of the nut. Next, we're going to flip the machine over so that we can install the handle. Grab the chain connector and pull that down so that there's some tension on the chain, and then go ahead and flip the machine over. Now with your hand on the chain connector, move the monitor support arm out of the way so you have some room. And take the generator base and we're going to slide it through the hole. And this is where you want to look inside and confirm that the chain is going around the sprocket. In my case, it's not right now, so get it lined up again. Here we go. Now take the generator housing and move it into place. On machines without the ASAT screw, it's going to pop into place. Now we can go ahead and install the handle with tension now from the shock cord. One way to do this without having to work against the shock cord is to install the handle on this side of the chain guide and guide arms, guide brackets. So take the swivel bushing and we're going to slide it onto the chain. And then slide the U-bolt through the hole. And put it through the holes in the front of the handle. Flip the handle over and thread the 7/16" nuts onto the legs of the U-bolt. These are nylock nuts, so you just want to engage the screw into the nylon part of the nut to keep it so that the nuts don't come off. And you're looking to get it so that the end of the screw is flush with the end of the nut. On Model C machines or machines with wooden handles, you're going to want to then tap these nuts back into the wooden part of the handle. With the handle installed, you can slide the handle through the guide bracket. Next, we're going to reinstall the generator and the housing on machines with the ASAT. You want to reach on the inside of the box frame and position the ASAT up against the bottom of the housing, and take your T27 screw and tighten it. And you're going to grab the generator and position it in the housing. Note that the generator coil wire does weave in the housing. This is a strain relief, so that if the wire is tugged, then it won't be pulled onto the generator. And then slide the wire underneath the lip on the inner pan of the flywheel housing. Take the generator cover and slide the lip underneath the inner pan of the flywheel housing. And install the 2 Phillips head screws. Next, we're going to reinstall the flywheel housing and outlet perf. There are multiple ways to do this. The way that I prefer is align the flywheel cover with the inner pan of the flywheel housing, and then lightly thread the 4 fasteners into the nuts that are in the recessed hex hole pockets on the inner pan of the flywheel housing. All 4 fasteners are very lightly threaded into the nuts on the inner pan of the flywheel housing. This is very loose, and it needs to be so that we can slide the metal outlet perf underneath these screw housings. There are 2 ends of the metal outlet perf. One has the screw with the nut, and the other has a spot for the head of the screw to slide into. You want to make it so that this screw is loose, but definitely threaded into that nut. And we are going to route the metal outlet perf underneath these screw housings and just lace it around the perimeter of the flywheel housing. Here are the 2 ends of the metal outlet perf. Take the screw and slide it into the perf connector. And we can slide this around. We're going to hide this whole perf connector underneath this screw housing. Lightly tighten this fastener. Now take 2 hands and slide this around and underneath this screw housing. And you can tighten this screw a little bit more. Now go around to these 4 fasteners and get them tight so that the flywheel cover is tight up against the inner pan of the flywheel housing. Okay, the last step is replacing the return mechanism cover. So grab the foot strap and tilt the machine on end so that the foot stretchers are up in the air, and there are 2 ends of the return mechanism cover. The narrow end goes towards the flywheel side, and the wider end is near the foot stretchers. Slide the return mechanism cover underneath the shock cord pulleys and above the leg. Now we can reattach the front end of the machine to the monorail end of the machine, tilt the machine back so that the foot stretchers are about waist high, grab the end of the monorail, and slide the hanger onto the hanger shaft, and lower the machine down so that the frame lock is engaged, and you can put the handle back in the handle hook, and you are done replacing the chain, axle, sprocket, and shock cord. This is the hardware that you're going to have left over if you do not have a Model C. These are all used on the Model C machine. These are for the flywheel cover, and these U-nuts are also to attach the flywheel cover. This is the placeholder screw that we use for the chain out of pulley axle.